That was the easy one. And if I dare to say, I think Malaysia didn't really expect to win on this one. Yeah. But why not make the argument? And it was also a chance to argue on the basis of, as they will do later, for some of the other claims, that this ILUC thing was very uncertain, was debated, was disputed as to its relevance. Okay. Looking at the claims under Article 2.2, which is the obligation that technical regulations should not be unnecessary obstacles to international trade. Here we look at both measures at issue, the 7% max and the high ILUC risk biofuel cap and phase out. Question is, are they more trade restrictive than necessary to fulfill a legitimate objective? That was the question that the panel was faced with. The first question, of course, is what is the objective? What is the objective of the measure? Now, the European Union argued that the objective of the measure was to limit the risk of ILUC-related greenhouse gas emissions associated with crop-based biofuels. That's what they argued. Malaysia said, well, that's very nice, but we think that there is a basic protectionist objective behind this measure because of the way in which you define the high ILUC risk biofuels. The way in which that was defined meant that it only focused on palm oil biofuels. Because of that, you basically protect biofuels that are made with European rapeseed and soybeans, and you protect. So it's a protectionist objective. The panel rejected this, or at least the panel said Malaysia has not substantiated its assertion that the measure's actual objective is protection in the cover of environmental protection. The dissenter among the panelists disagrees with that. I'll come back to that later. Now, third element, you have to look at whether the objective of limiting the risk of ILUC-related greenhouse gas emissions is a legitimate objective. And we have established what the objective is. Now the next step is, and go back every time to the chapeau here. Have to establish whether it is a legitimate objective. And the panel came to the conclusion that it is prima facie, on the basis of a first analysis, it is a legitimate objective because it is within the scope of policies directed to the protection of human, animal, or plant life or health. And that is one of the policy objectives that was identified in Article 2 itself. So prima facie, they say it is a legitimate objective. Then you come to the question whether the measure is there to fulfill is necessary to fulfill that legitimate objective. So we have established that what the objective is. We have established that the objective is prima facie legitimate. Now the question is whether whether the measure at issue is necessary to fulfill that legitimate objective. Establishment of legitimacy under Article 2.2 is first of all a weighing and balancing. That's how you start. A weighing and balancing of three factors. For those who are familiar with Article 20 and the necessity that under Article 20 said, oh, that sounds familiar. Yes, that sounds familiar because it is not exactly the same test, but very much the same test. Yeah? So you weigh and balance three things. You weigh and balance, first of all, you look at the trade restrictiveness of the measure. Yeah? And there the panel said, well, the measure had, by design, a limiting effect on trade. So yes, there's a trade restrictive effect. It doesn't really pronounce on the it doesn't qualify that restrictive effect as being high or low, but it says there's a restrictive effect. Secondly, you have to look at, that's the second thing you have to balance, you have to look at the risks that non-fulfillment of the objectives would create. So now, if you don't fulfill the objective has been defined as it's really reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What are the consequences of non-fulfillment? How bad is that? And there it says that the risks, the consequences that non-fulfillment of the objective would create is that greenhouse gas emissions savings resulting from the promotion of conventional biofuels are undermined by their ILUC-related GMO genetic greenhouse gas emissions. Because clearly, when they would use for fuel in transportation, when they would use biofuels, then greenhouse gas emissions would go lower. But if they use biofuels that are from food crops that have replaced forests, for which there was a high risk of ILUC, then of course these forests would no longer be there to absorb greenhouse gases. So there's a risk of promoting biofuels, but at the same time destroying forests. So you would be, by promoting biofuels without regard, you would actually undermine the objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions because you would be destroying forests which are places that capture greenhouse gases. A third thing that you have to weigh and balance is whether the measure is apt to make a contribution to the objective of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And the panel, yes, it's apt, it can contribute. The panel was weighing and balancing all that, and it came to the conclusion, preliminary conclusion, that the measures were necessary to fulfill their objective. Not finished here. A necessity inquiry under Article 2.2 of the TBT Agreement, just like under Article 20, necessity test under Article 20, doesn't only need you to weigh and balance, but it also needs you, in most cases, requires you to look at whether there is a reasonably available alternative measure that is less trade restrictive, but nevertheless achieves the objective pursued. And that is what Malaysia claimed. Malaysia actually claimed that there were 5 alternative measures that would be less trade restrictive and that would allow, that were reasonably available and that would allow the European Union to achieve its objective. The panel disagreed. The panel disagreed along the whole line for slightly different reasons. Sometimes they said that the alternative advanced by Malaysia was not realistically available. And sometimes they said, well, this measure would not achieve the objectives pursued by the European Union. So none of the alternative measures was withheld, which made the panel come to the conclusion that Malaysia failed to establish that the measures were inconsistent with Article 2.2. There's a dissent. One of the 3 panelists severely, it's a dissent, severely disagreed. According to that panelist, the objective of the measure appears to include, very diplomatic language in a way, but appears to include an element of protectionism. And he goes on working that out by saying that the degree of arbitrariness in singling out palm oil-based biofuel from the perspective of the stated objective, namely reducing greenhouse gases, and the student says, well, it was arbitrary to focus just on palm oil-based biofuel, because rapeseed-based biofuel and soybean-based biofuel are also contributing to ILUC, and yet they are not targeted by this measure. So there's an element of arbitrariness, and from that arbitrariness, he says, well, that gives the idea of protectionism. That reveals protectionism. The fact that the European Union did not include rapeseed and soybeans, products that they themselves produce and are used in the production of biofuels. And for that, he says that the legitimate objective is not, or that the objective is not exclusively legitimate. And for the dissenter, the legitimate objective has to be exclusively legitimate, which is pushing it. Because I would say, arguing now against the case of Malaysia, but then very few measures exclusively pursue one policy objective. There's always room for multiple policy objectives, even non-intended. Yeah? Even if you have a perfectly justifiable, pure environmental measure, well, that environmental measure may actually also have some protectionist unintended objectives. Now, there's perhaps a contradiction in terms when you talk about an unintended objective. Yeah? Or a result, but yes.
TBT does not disallow non-arbitrary measures per se under Article 2.2 will be. There isn't a condition that the measure should not be arbitrary.
Should not be what?
Should not be arbitrary. I mean, unlike Article 20 exception, wherein the conditions of chapeau have to be complied with, I don't think there's a condition of, direct, particularly non-arbitrariness under BGP.
We should be careful. Article 2.2 of the TBT agreement is not an exception provision. Yeah? And I know where you come from. You say, well, we have this necessity test that is being applied, and that necessity test is similar to the one that we have under the GATT 20.
Dissenting opinion?
Yeah.
He pointed out degree of arbitrariness. I'm curious to know where it can be disputed. That is true. The arbitrary part of it.
Okay. Yes, there you make a good point. But then, if you would try to apply in the context of trying to invoke Article 20, the arbitrariness would make you fail under the chapeau. Is that your point? Yes, that's true. Yeah, and actually that's what the panel does when they look at the GATT provisions. Then, of course, the European Union invoked Article 20, and the panel again, the dissent again makes this argument, but this is the panel still finds, as it did under the TBT agreement, that also the conditions of the chapeau are fulfilled, because they they just don't see this element of protectionism. The majority doesn't see that. The majority refuses to accept that the policy had also protectionist alternatives. And it's only when you are willing to accept that there's also this protectionism that you would have an argument. Well done. Now, coming to the last claim, the claim under Article 2.1 of the TBT Agreement, and I'm taking them in reverse order. Most of the work was done on this claim. That's the non-discrimination claim, or in terms of claims of inconsistency, and the claim that the European measures were discriminatory. I've already said most of that, but what the panel finds, and they find in favor of Malaysia on this, what the panel finds that rapeseed-based and soybean-based biofuels produced in the EU, or, and that's the other aspect of the case, but you don't have to worry about that, let's just jump it, produced in the EU are like palm oil-based biofuels imported from Malaysia. Now, were they identical? No, because there was a very complicated scientific discussion underlying this, but if you use biofuel from palm oil, this would work perfectly in India. Unless, of course, you're in the mountain areas. It's a question of that biofuel, for starters, I should say that we don't use biofuel as the only fuel that then is being used to drive a car. There are blends. We use the normal fuel and then we blend that with biofuel. And often that is as a result of government regulation that says that all fuels are being marketed have to have biofuel in it. Now, then you have choices between different kinds of biofuel. The European biofuels can be used also at very low temperatures. Or if they are mixed with normal fuels, you can continue to use that mixture at very low temperatures. The minute that you increase the amount of biofuel that you put into the normal fuel, the temperature at which your car will still work goes up and up and up, which is not a problem here, which is not a problem in Italy or Spain most of the time, which is a huge problem in Norway and Denmark. So there is difference in these products. But the question that the panel was confronted with is that difference enough? Certainly taking into account that these biofuels are not used as a sole fuel, they're blended. Is that enough to say that there is no competitive relationship between the palm oil-based biofuels and the other biofuels? And the panel said, no, there is a competitive relationship. Actually, there's a strong competitive relationship because whenever they possibly can, fuel producers, the blenders, will try to use as much biofuel from palm oil because that's the cheapest. That's the cheapest. So they came to the conclusion that there is, and rejected the European Union's arguments that these products were not in competition. They are in competition.
So the argument was regarding the origin of these fuels and not how they're used and how they perform well in the market. The question of it being a high elect greenhouse gas emitting fuel is based on how it is harvested. If palm oil was harvested on agricultural land, it would be what you said, not elect but the other part, direct use.
Yeah.
Direct.
Yeah.
So the question was how they are originated or how they're harvested for these oil products. The question was never how they're used by these consumers or by these
No, no. The ultimate use by the consumers was never an issue.
The issue was always the origin, how they're harvested for these purposes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when the panel said that there is there is competition between the two and the palm oil is being preferred by these manufacturers when they're mixing the biofuel, it's NDM how they're using it. But the question or the restriction that was imposed by the EU on Malaysian palm oil was regarding how it is harvested because of the indirect effect of such harvesting.
Yeah. When you say how it was harvested, yeah, I could agree with that. I mean, that's not the language that the panel has used, but yes, it's a good paraphrasing of what happened. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so this is what the panel concluded on the likeness of the products, and then they go on with the normal determination of whether there's discrimination, yeah? Whether there is treatment less favorable. And then that process of establishing whether this treatment less favorable start as it is done in the same way under Article 3.4. So in order to establish whether less favorable treatment is given, you establish whether the measure has a detrimental impact on the important palm oil based biofuel. And that detrimental impact was obvious. But, and this is where discrimination under Article 2.1 differs from discrimination under Article 3.4, GATT. You can't stop here. You cannot stop just at determining that the measures have a detrimental impact on the imported product. Under the GATT, under Article 3.4, you stop there and you find that there's a violation of the national treatment obligation. And then subsequently, you move to Article 20 and you see whether you can justify that consistency, that violation. Now, the TBT agreement does not have an Article 20 equivalent. There is no possibility under the TBT agreement to justify, there's no provision in the TBT agreement to justify measures that would be found to be inconsistent with the national treatment obligation, merely because they have a detrimental impact on the imported product. First time that the appellate body was confronted with this reality of the absence of an Article 20 justification possibility was in the US clove cigarettes case. And I was one of the judges on that division. And to be honest, I mean, we were almost shocked in the beginning because applying the non-discrimination test, applying the test to establish whether there's treatment less favorable, we went back to the GATT, to Article 3.4, and we said, okay, is there a detrimental impact on the imported products? And in that case, that was obviously the case. And so what? Because in that case, you could well argue that there were public health considerations to justify the measure at issue there. But there was no Article 20 in the GATT. So what the appellate body did in that case, yes, I mean, if you accuse the appellate body of judicial activism, I think this is one place where you can do that with reason. They looked at the preamble of the TBT agreement. And from the preamble, it was pretty clear that the idea was to leave room for WTO members to take measures for the protection of, among other things, public health. Or in this context, the protection of the environment. And therefore, the non-discrimination obligation could not be such that that room that was provided for in the preamble would not be present. Thus, the appellate body has interpreted the non-discrimination obligation as including the possibility of having measures that pursue certain societal values and interests. Yeah? So, meaning that the measure is not discriminatory. Not a question that it can be justified. The measure itself is not discriminatory when the detrimental impact, which is there, stems exclusively from a legitimate regulatory distinction. That's the wording. Stems exclusively from a legitimate regulatory distinction. And believe me, we discussed that wording. There's a couple of words for at least 2 days. That has then further been worked out in the case law, subsequent case law, as what exactly that means. Yeah, that's not totally relevant here, because here, yeah. So we have established that there is a detrimental impact of the measure on the imported products. Yes, but is there a legitimate regulatory distinction? First question is, what is the regulatory distinction here? Regulatory distinction is the classification of palm oil as high ILUC risk feedstock. That's the regulatory distinction. Because depending on whether a product is or is not fall under this cap and phase out, you have to look at whether it's high ILUC risk. So that's the regulatory distinction. Now, is that regulatory distinction legitimate? That's the second question. Is it legitimate? Well, the panel says that a regulatory distinction based on a high degree of ILUC risk, of which many will say, high ILUC risk, you can't really measure ILUC, you can't really observe it. No? But the panel said a regulatory distinction based on a high ILUC risk is a priori a legitimate distinction. This panel really liked the word a priori. Yeah? And yes, I mean, if this would have gone to appeal, I know where I would have started. Yeah? But a priori, it's a legitimate distinction. And then the panel makes some very useful comments and through comments. Yeah? Perhaps to justify the fact that they say a priori legitimate, they're not quite sure whether they're right. Yeah? But they say, first of all, we've heard this discussion among the parties about whether ILUC is really something you can observe, you can quantify, whether you really should give much importance to ILUC. Yeah? We've heard the parties, but the panel is not attempting here, and it's not the task of the panel to resolve scientific debates on the basis of the evidence submitted. So there are a lot of evidence submitted on ILUC. As I said, it's not our task to resolve that scientific debate. What is our task is to determine whether there is a reasonable basis for the regulatory distinction and the manner in which it is applied. Do I agree with this panel? Well, as I said, I'm biased. Huh? I was very disappointed to read this. But taking a broader perspective, I would say, and panels and the appellate body have said this similar things before, yes, because a WTO panel is not a body of scientific knowledge. Yeah? So perhaps that is indeed true, correct. The panel's task is limited to determine whether there is a reasonable basis for the regulatory distinction and the manner in which it is applied. Now you can disagree on whether there is indeed this reasonable basis. Yeah, but I think that the European Union made enough of an argument that the way in which they looked at ILUC and the way they were planning to apply it and apply it in the meantime was constituted a reasonable basis for the regulatory distinction. But The European Union did at least make one mistake. Well, not at least, it did make one mistake. And that's what the panel identified. This is why you find this conclusion. The EU administered the high ILUC risk biofuel cap and phase out inconsistently with Article 2.1 for the following very narrow reason. Namely, because they failed to conduct a timely review of the data used to determine which biofuels are high ILUC risk. The data that the European Union had used were old data. And the panel said, well, even if you are allowed to use high ILUC risk as the legitimate regulatory distinction, your data should have been more updated. And this is why I say that while the Malaysia lost the case, this claim was thrown out, in its majority, we don't know what will come out of these updated data on ILUC risk. It may well be that the new data show that also rapeseed biofuels and soybean biofuels have as high ILUC risk as the palm oil-based biofuels. Yeah. And if that is the case, then of course the situation becomes very different for. Now there's a dissent, and the dissent goes along lines you may expect. The dissent says that the detrimental impact of the cap and the phase out does not extend exclusively from a legitimate regulatory distinction, and therefore is inconsistent with Article 1. Or this would have been a beauty of case to get on appeal. So the panel report was circulated on the 10th of January, and there's now another panel report in the Indonesian case, which is virtually identical, that was circulated last Friday. What has the European Union complied? Well, they have expressed their intention to implement, but have asked for a reasonable period of time. And that is the last information that is publicly available on this. And this is already May 2024. So there's something happening behind the scenes, because nothing is being communicated. My expectation, my guess is that there are two things, and yes, I should bring this lecture to an end, but there are two things. First of all, the European Union is really in a bind by updating these high ILUC risk data, because they may show something that they don't want to be shown, namely that the high ILUC risk also is there for the products, the biofuel that is produced from products that they themselves produce. So they may be reconsidering the whole RED 2. That's one aspect. The other aspect deals with another piece of legislation that you may be familiar with, and that is the European Union deforestation-free products regulation, which actually, when it does get applied, because the application has now been delayed by a full year, The regulation is there, it's adopted, but the application has been delayed by a full year because couldn't really figure out how it was going to work. Yeah, so they need more time to reflect on this. But if that would be applied in the way it is understood, at least by the Commission, it would actually make the whole red superfluous. Yeah. So it would be able to do the work that now the red 2 does in terms of addressing biofuels. That's a second reason why perhaps there is little activity on following up on the expression of intent to implement and to request a reasonable period of time. Normally, then it goes much faster. You agree on a reasonable period of time, or the Director General will appoint an arbitrator to determine what the reasonable period of time is. There is, policy space left for WTO members to address the climate crisis. I think that there are a few interesting takeaways from this case. I think one interesting thing is the flexibility that the panel did show in defining what light credits are. So they did not take an extreme position. For the rest, I think it indicates more a restrictive view. Not if you read the dissent, but the majority reflects a restrictive view of the policy space that would still be left for members to address the climate crisis.
Giving this legitimate distinction.
Sorry, I misstated the last thing. It's the opposite. Sorry, I missed. Getting tired. It's the opposite. The panel has actually shown. Thank you. The panel has actually shown with quite a lot of policy space. The dissent not. Yeah, quite a lot of policy space. It's a reflection of where I was in that case with my heart, and that is, yeah. The question is whether that is a good thing. Yeah. Because, yes, we need these unilateral environmental climate-related measures, but they should not come at the expense of developing countries. That's the... Right. With that at the closure, we'll be discussing tomorrow a case that was brought recently by India, not by India, by China against the United States, the IRA case, which is nowhere yet. So I will also need you to help us think about what the arguments could be that China is going to make. I suppose the submission of China is already in, but that's not public. And then the other case that isn't even been challenged yet, CBAM. That's what we'll talk about tomorrow. See you tomorrow.